Hi there, this is Christine with Imaginarium Cakes. Today I'm going to show you how I make modeling chocolate fondant. Adding modeling chocolate to my fondant has been the most amazing transformation for my fondant. It gives it such an incredible taste and handle that I don't think you'll ever go back to regular fondant. When I make this, I make it from scratch. Most people that I've seen do it make their modeling chocolate the normal way you would make modeling chocolate. When I do this, I do it slightly different. I don't like leaving my modeling chocolate to set and properly set. I prefer to use it as soon as I've made it. And I do a couple of things different that I'll go through as I'm showing you. What you'll need for this is 1.5 kg of fondant of your choice. It doesn't really matter what kind of fondant. Different fondants are different and have different properties depending on their additives. Today I'm using satin ice, but there's no reason you couldn't use Bakels or Royal Ice or Regal Ice. Whatever you have will work. I have 1.5 kg. For American terms, I would probably use 3 pounds, which is slightly less, but it won't really matter. The ratio that I tend to go for between the modeling chocolate and my fondant is somewhere between 3 to 4 parts fondant to 1 part modeling chocolate. It doesn't need to be exact. I make mine quite a high ratio because I tend to use the white to mix with my other colors. I mix in my red, I mix in my pink, I mix in my yellow. So you're going to knock that ratio back to probably 4 to 1, possibly even 5 to 1, depending on what you what color you're making. So that is the fondant. Today I'm using the Wilton candy melts. The bag I have is 12 ounces, which is 3/4 of a pound. And I will be using just slightly more than a 1/4 cup. It's about 0.28 of a cup of your Caro syrup. I am using the Caro light syrup. If you are using glucose syrup, which is a more easily found corn syrup outside the States, you might just have to play with your ratios. The difference about the way I make it is I tend to err a little bit on the high side. So if I use a full 1/3 of a cup with the 12 ounce, that's a little bit more corn syrup than I need, but you would rather have it slightly stickier than drier. If you've ever made modeling chocolate and you haven't put enough corn syrup, you know that when you go to knead it, it can turn into a crumbly mess. That's easily remedied by adding more corn syrup and mixing it through, kneading it through. But for our purposes, we're not even going to knead it. So the first step I do is knead my fondant. The other trick that I do, I don't like warming my corn syrup in the microwave. I find it gets kind of a bit of a film and don't like the way it behaves. So I actually use my glass Pyrex measuring cups. I pour boiling water in them and I let them sit until the measuring cup itself has warmed. Once that's warmed, I dump that out and I measure out my corn syrup. Now I've already done that here, but just to show you that I do pretty much completely fill it so that it can warm the entire glass. And that way you're warming the corn syrup without really overwarming it. The next thing you'll do is melt your chocolate. For 1 pack, which I quite happily use when I'm making my fondant, and if I'm actually making modeling chocolate, I don't use less than 2 packs of the candy melts. I just find so many errors. So many things can go wrong with a small amount of chocolate. But for our purposes today, since we're basically going to be seasoning the chocolate and directly mixing it in with our fondant, it won't really matter. The other important thing to consider before you start is your surface. If you have a stone surface or a stainless steel surface, you will end up having a lumpy fondant, and you will think, oh, I've just wasted this whole batch of fondant. So the best thing I would suggest is buying some sort of a mat that you can work on that's plastic, and also have a slip mat underneath. That will provide as a bit of insulation as well as hold your mat in place. So once you've melted your chocolate, and for this 1 bag batch, I let it go for about a minute initially, and then another 30-second burst. I stir in between both, and then I will usually do about another 10 or 15-second burst after that, and my microwave is 1100 watts. I usually let mine cool down. It doesn't need to be made when it's hot. And I actually find I have far fewer problems if I let my chocolate cool before I put in my corn syrup. So once it's melted and it's cooled a bit, that's when you put in your corn syrup. Now, if you're making modeling chocolate, proper modeling chocolate, you need to be as gentle as possible while you're folding in the corn syrup. If you get a bit too rough, and anybody who's made modeling chocolate has likely messed up a batch, you'll know what I mean. You'll find that all the wax that has been replaced in the melts, all the wax that has replaced the cocoa butter in melts, which is the reason why it's such an easier product to use, separates out, and you end up with this kind of gluggy mess. Now, you're actually going to see that when we mix it in with the fondant, because I'm not going to wait for my modeling chocolate to cool. So you don't have to be as gentle with this as you do with modeling chocolate. Normally I kind of stir like this when I'm making my modeling chocolate. But today, and honestly one of the best things you can do if you have a bad batch of modeling chocolate, go grab a couple packs of fondant and mix it in, because it won't go to waste that way. As long as the chocolate and the wax that have separated out are still liquidy, you'll be fine. If they're starting to seize up before you get it mixed in with your fondant, you'll find you'll probably have a few lumps. But for our purposes, it won't really matter. You can see that that's pretty well seized up. There are some pockets left there of chocolate, and you can tell you want to make sure that you completely seize all the chocolate. And again, it won't really matter. If I was making proper modeling chocolate, I would stop right there. But as you can see, if I keep going, a lot of that wax will come out, but it won't really matter too much for our purposes. At this point, get your fondant out. And I kind of tend to make a big hole in the middle. Stretch it out a bit. It won't really matter too much. And dump this in. Now you will notice when I dump this, I'm actually adding modeling chocolate that is ivory colored to my white fondant. If you want completely white fondant, you will need to add some, I would suggest the chocolate white coloring, only because it works the best on the chocolate. But even if you have a whitener, it should still lighten your tone a bit. So at this point, you can see if I left this to set, it would be fine as modeling chocolate. Slight bit of the wax surface coming out on that. But for our purposes, it won't matter. And just go ahead and start kneading it. Now, if you were doing this straight onto a stainless steel countertop or a stone countertop, you would find that that surface is so cold that the wax starts to solidify and the chocolate starts to solidify. And what you end up with are massive bits and lumps in your fondant, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a nice smooth fondant in the first place. And now, like I said before, if you had a batch of modeling chocolate that went bad, dump the whole batch into the fondant. It will gush, it will sound disgusting, it will feel gross, it will feel very wrong, but just keep going, because there is no point in ruining and wasting a whole batch of chocolate. It's just not something you want to throw in the trash. So just keep kneading it through. And as you go, you'll find the texture of your fondant has changed. Move my mat back a bit. If you were doing this on stone or steel, you would end up with a very thick layer of solidified chocolate. And if it wasn't chocolate, it would be the wax from your chocolate. And as you knead, you would start picking up those dry bits. And you can see I have a couple, just little bits here, and I just removed those. You could incorporate them, but I find it gives a higher chance of a lumpy fondant. So just keep kneading. You'll know when it's pretty well kneaded through. But what you get is this nice, shiny fondant. And you will find that if you put this around something where you have seams, say a square, and you are doing the top separate from the sides around the square, you will be able to smooth out the seams with this fondant to where they are almost invisible. It's almost like using modeling chocolate. Quite amazing how that extra bit of chocolate and wax that you've added in to the fondant really does change the properties and consistency of the fondant. So after that, just put it back in your bag. I have used it straight away. I quite often let it sit for 3 or 4 hours and just kind of firm up a bit, because remember, all that wax is still in there. But you can use it straight away. You'll find it still is beautiful, but it does work best if you let it sit for a few hours just to cure. And that's it. I hope you give it a go and that you enjoyed this little tutorial. Happy caking!